The cruelest thing about being laughed at isn't the laughter itself, it's the moment you start believing they might be right. I never imagined that millions of strangers would know my name before a single one of them knew the truth. It started on a Thursday that smelled like fresh coffee and spring rain, the kind of morning that usually made me believe good things were still possible. I left my tiny apartment just after 7 with a canvas bag over my shoulder, a lesson plan tucked inside, and enough cash in my wallet for gas and a sandwich if I skipped my afternoon latte. My old blue Honda groaned every time I started the engine, but it had never let me down. Neither had hope. At least not yet. I taught art to middle school kids because someone once told me that broken hearts often learn to speak through paint before they trusted words again. Most days, I believed that. Most days, I walked into room 214 with a smile that became real the second my students started arguing over colors and clay. But that Thursday wasn't most days. Our school had partnered with a downtown charity gala, inviting teachers to display student artwork for donors willing to fund public education. It sounded simple. Smile. Answer questions. Tell people why creativity mattered. I wore the only navy dress I owned, one my mother had bought years before she passed away, and I whispered to my reflection that everything would be okay. By 6 o'clock, the ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers while conversations floated through the air like polished performances. Expensive suits. Designer gowns. Cameras everywhere. I felt invisible until I accidentally wasn't. A famous online personality stepped backward while recording a live stream. I reached out instinctively to stop an elderly volunteer from stumbling into him, but from the camera's angle, it looked as though I had shoved him on purpose. His phone spun onto the marble floor. Gasps echoed around the room. Someone laughed. Then another person did. Within minutes, clips of the moment spread across every platform imaginable. No one uploaded what happened before. No one cared that the volunteer had remained standing because I caught her arm. The only thing people shared was the 5-second clip that made me look jealous, rude, and desperate for attention. By the time I reached my car, my phone vibrated so violently I thought something was wrong with it. Thousands of notifications poured across the screen faster than I could read them. Strangers called me pathetic. Entitled. Clumsy. Attention-hungry. They created memes before I even made it home. Overnight, my face belonged to the internet. By sunrise, millions had watched the same lie. They laughed together while I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at cold coffee, wondering how one missing moment could erase 27 years of trying to be kind. I turned off my phone, but silence couldn't stop the world from talking, and somewhere across the city, a man who had built an empire by noticing details everyone else ignored watched the same video only once before narrowing his eyes, because unlike millions of others, he wasn't looking at me, he was looking at everything happening around me. I expected the storm to pass after a day. That was how embarrassment had always worked in my life. You apologized, people forgot, and tomorrow quietly arrived carrying another chance. Instead, Friday morning greeted me with 37 missed calls, more than 200 unread messages, and an email from the school district asking me not to report to work until further notice. My apartment felt unusually small as pale sunlight slipped through the blinds and landed across my kitchen table. My coffee tasted bitter long before it cooled. I kept staring at the ceramic mug because looking anywhere else meant looking at my phone, and my phone had become a doorway into a world where complete strangers seemed convinced they knew exactly who I was. My principal called just after 8. Her voice sounded tired, the way people sound when they are trying to be kind while protecting themselves at the same time. She said the school needed time. Parents were upset. Reporters had called the front office. Some families believed I had embarrassed the district. She reminded me that she personally knew I cared about my students, but public pressure had become impossible to ignore. I thanked her because she did not deserve my frustration. After we hung up, I cried for exactly 3 minutes before wiping my face and making my bed. My mother used to tell me that keeping one promise to yourself every morning made it easier to survive the rest of the day. Making the bed counted. Around noon, I forced myself outside to buy groceries. I pulled a baseball cap low over my blonde hair and hoped nobody would recognize me. For 10 peaceful minutes, it worked. Then a teenager glanced at me twice before whispering something to his friend. Both of them looked at their phones. One of them laughed. Neither of them said a word to my face, but they did not have to. Their expressions did all the talking. I left my shopping basket where it was and walked back to my car with empty hands. It amazed me how quickly shame could become heavier than hunger. Back inside my apartment, I opened my email and found dozens of messages. Some called me names. Others demanded that I apologize for something I had never intended to do. Buried between them was one message from the elderly volunteer I had caught before she fell. She wrote that she had tried telling reporters what really happened, but nobody wanted her interview because it was not exciting enough. She ended her note with one sentence that stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Do not let strangers rewrite your heart. I read those words again and again until they blurred. Across Manhattan, inside a quiet office overlooking the river, Damien DeLuca sat alone before a wall of glass while the muted television replayed the same viral clip for what felt like the 100th time. His advisors had already dismissed it as another meaningless internet scandal. They moved on to business contracts and investment reports. Damien did not. He pressed pause at precisely the same frame every single time. While everyone else watched the woman at the center of the screen, he watched the elderly volunteer behind her. He watched Claire reach backward before anyone else reacted. He watched the expression on her face before the phone ever hit the floor. It was not arrogance. It was concern. One missing second had transformed compassion into cruelty, and Damien had built his entire life on understanding that the smallest missing detail could change everything. The strange thing about truth is that it does not disappear when people ignore it. It simply waits for someone patient enough to notice it. I spent Saturday morning sitting on the floor beside my living room window with a stack of student paintings spread around me. Bright sunsets. Crooked family portraits. Fingerprints pressed into watercolor skies. Tiny reminders that children still believed mistakes could become masterpieces. I wanted to believe that too. Instead of opening social media, I graded projects that no one had asked me to finish. My suspension had not officially become permanent, but silence from the school district felt louder with every passing hour. Outside, traffic drifted along the street below while rain tapped gently against the glass. Life continued for everyone except me. Across the city, Damien DeLuca replayed the charity gala footage from every angle his security team could legally obtain. He never trusted a single camera when there were 10 available. His reputation had been built on details that other people dismissed. A reflection in a window. A shadow moving half a second too early. A conversation hidden beneath background noise. This time, the missing detail appeared in the polished surface of a decorative mirror hanging behind the crowd. While the viral clip showed only me reaching forward, another camera captured the elderly volunteer losing her balance moments before. Frame by frame, Damien watched my left hand steady the woman while my right shoulder accidentally brushed against the influencer. There was no shove. No anger. No desperate attempt to attract attention. Just one ordinary act of kindness destroyed by an unfortunate camera angle. He leaned back in his chair without saying a word. His chief of security waited quietly across the room. Finally, Damien spoke. Find every recording from that ballroom. Every guest. Every employee. Every security camera. His voice remained calm, but calm from a man like Damien carried unusual weight. His assistant asked whether the woman mattered. Damien looked toward the rain beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows before answering. Everyone else judged what happened after the phone fell. I want to know what happened before. Meanwhile, I forced myself to return to ordinary life. The refrigerator needed groceries whether people hated me or not. Bills still arrived. Rent still waited. I stopped at a neighborhood farmer's market where nobody seemed interested in internet scandals. An older vendor smiled as he handed me fresh apples and told me they had arrived from upstate that morning. For the first time in days, someone looked into my eyes instead of looking at my face with recognition. It felt surprisingly healing. As I walked home carrying 2 paper bags, I noticed a little girl struggling to gather colored pencils that had spilled across the sidewalk. Cars rolled past. Busy adults hurried around her. I set my groceries down without thinking and knelt beside her. Together we picked up every pencil, even the tiny white one that had rolled beneath a parked truck. The little girl smiled with complete sincerity before running back to her mother. She did not know my name. She did not care about the internet. She only knew that someone had stopped to help. From inside a black SUV waiting across the street, tinted windows hiding everything beyond the glass, Damien watched the moment unfold in silence. He had expected evidence. Instead, he found consistency. The woman from the video had just done exactly what she had done at the gala. She helped first and thought about herself second. For Damien, that was no longer coincidence. It was character. Monday arrived wearing gray clouds and the smell of wet pavement, as though the city itself had decided not to smile. I woke before my alarm out of habit, forgetting for one peaceful second that I no longer had a classroom waiting for me. The silence inside my apartment felt unfamiliar. My paint-stained sneakers remained by the front door. My lesson plans rested neatly inside my canvas bag. Everything looked ready for a life that had suddenly stopped moving. I refused to spend another day hiding, so I carried my sketchbook to the small community park 3 blocks away. Children chased pigeons across the grass while parents sipped coffee from paper cups. Nobody there seemed interested in trending headlines. I found an empty bench beneath a maple tree and began sketching whatever caught my eye. An old couple holding hands. A boy trying to fly a bright red kite. A golden retriever rolling happily through the grass. Drawing had always slowed the noise inside my head. For the first time in days, I could hear my own thoughts instead of everyone else's opinions. Across the street, Damien watched from the back seat of the same black SUV. He had cancelled 2 business meetings without explanation, something that surprised everyone who worked for him. His chief of security quietly handed him a folder filled with information collected over the weekend. Employment history. Volunteer records. College transcripts. Letters of recommendation. Not one document resembled the cruel image the internet had created. Every former supervisor described Claire Bennett with nearly identical words. Patient. Honest. Dependable. Generous. Damien closed the folder and looked through the window again. Facts mattered to him far more than rumors ever could. He watched me spend nearly 20 minutes helping an elderly man retrieve scattered grocery bags after one of them tore open near the sidewalk. I laughed with him while gathering oranges that rolled toward the curb. Nobody recorded that moment. Nobody applauded. I simply did what felt natural before returning to my bench and continuing my sketch. Damien noticed something else. Every time someone glanced at me with recognition, I lowered my eyes instead of becoming defensive. Shame had become visible in the way I carried my shoulders. He understood that expression. Years earlier, long before success had placed expensive suits inside his closet, he had worn the same quiet weight after being blamed for mistakes he had never made. Different circumstances. Same loneliness. His phone buzzed softly. One of his advisors informed him that public interest in the viral story remained strong and recommended ignoring it entirely. Damien responded with only 2 words. Keep digging. Late that afternoon I stopped by the neighborhood library to return overdue art books. The librarian smiled warmly and quietly waived my late fees after recognizing me. She did not mention the internet. She simply whispered that everyone deserved a second chapter. Her kindness almost made me cry. As I stepped outside, the wind carried loose pages from a teenager's notebook across the sidewalk. Instinctively, I chased them before traffic could scatter them farther. The grateful student thanked me with an embarrassed smile before hurrying away. I never noticed the familiar black SUV waiting at the opposite corner until it pulled away moments later without making a sound. Damien rested one hand against the window as the city drifted past. He had begun this search expecting to expose a lie hidden beneath a carefully crafted image. Instead, every hour revealed the opposite. The woman everyone believed they understood became more remarkable each time nobody realized she was being watched. Tuesday morning arrived wrapped in cool air and pale sunshine, the kind of morning that made the city look kinder than it actually was. I decided to spend the day delivering the remaining art supplies from my classroom to a neighborhood youth center. If I was not allowed to teach for now, at least the paints and brushes could still belong to children who needed them. The cardboard boxes felt heavier with every block, but I refused to complain. Carrying something useful reminded me that I still had purpose even if the world had forgotten it. Halfway there, one of the boxes slipped from my arms as I stepped off the curb. Colored pencils scattered across the sidewalk in every direction. I sighed quietly and knelt to gather them before traffic changed. Suddenly another pair of hands reached for the same bright blue pencil. I looked up expecting to see another hurried stranger, but instead I found a man dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with effortless precision. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall, composed, with dark hair neatly combed back and calm gray eyes that seemed to notice everything without demanding attention. There was nothing loud about him. No expensive watch displayed for admiration. No impatient expression. He simply picked up the pencils one by one as though he had nowhere else to be. "Thank you," I said softly. "You really did not have to stop." He offered a faint smile that barely lifted the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes stopping is the most important thing a person can do." His voice was steady, warm without becoming familiar. Together we gathered every pencil until only one remained beneath a nearby parked car. Before I could reach for it, he crouched effortlessly and retrieved it, brushing away a little dust before placing it carefully into the box. "It belongs with the others," he said. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. It was a quiet laugh, surprised more than joyful, but real enough that I noticed it myself. "Thank you again. These are for children at the community center. They have been waiting for them." He glanced toward the colorful drawing sticking out from another box. "You are still thinking about your students." I blinked. "How did you know I was a teacher?" He paused for the briefest moment before answering. "The lesson plans tucked inside your bag gave it away." I looked down and realized the corner of a laminated classroom schedule had indeed slipped into view. I smiled, slightly embarrassed. "I guess I am not very mysterious." "Not everyone needs to be mysterious," he replied. "Some people are simply genuine." Before I could respond, a black sedan rolled quietly toward the curb. The driver remained inside, waiting with remarkable patience. The man gave me a polite nod. "I should let you get where you are going. The children should not have to wait." I watched him step toward the waiting car, wondering why someone who looked as though he belonged in the tallest office building in Manhattan had spent 10 minutes helping a stranger collect colored pencils from the sidewalk. I never asked his name. I never imagined that he already knew mine. As the sedan disappeared into afternoon traffic, Damien looked back once through the rear window. For the first time in years, he had shaken someone's hand without introducing himself, because before the world learned who he was, he wanted one chance to discover whether kindness could exist without the shadow of his name standing between them. The next afternoon the air smelled of fresh rain and blooming flowers, and for the first time in nearly a week I felt something that resembled peace. The community center had invited me to spend a few hours teaching children how to paint spring landscapes. They could not afford permanent art classes, but they always found room for imagination. Watching tiny hands dip brushes into bright colors reminded me why I had chosen this life in the first place. Children never asked whether you were trending online. They only wanted to know if the sky could be purple or whether trees had to stay green. I told them that art had room for honesty, and honesty sometimes looked different from what people expected. When the class ended, I packed the paint jars into plastic bins while parents slowly arrived to collect their children. That was when I noticed a little boy standing alone near the front entrance. He looked no older than 6, with dark brown hair, pale skin, and striking gray eyes that searched every face passing by. His small backpack rested beside his shoes, untouched. Everyone else had left. He had not moved. I walked over carefully and knelt so we were at the same height. "Are you waiting for someone, sweetheart?" He nodded without speaking. His lower lip trembled, but he tried very hard not to cry. "Do you know your parents' phone number?" Another quiet shake of his head. I smiled gently. "That is all right. We will figure it out together." We sat on the front steps while I offered him a bottle of water and a pack of crackers from my bag. After a few minutes he whispered that his name was Ethan. He had wandered away during a charity event in the park across the street after chasing a bright red balloon. He remembered his uncle's first name but nothing else. I told him that balloons had a funny way of leading people into unexpected adventures. He laughed softly, and the sound felt like a tiny victory. Inside a black SUV parked half a block away, Damien stared through the windshield before opening the door without waiting for anyone to speak. His security team had spent nearly 20 anxious minutes searching for Ethan after discovering he had slipped away from the family gathering. Damien crossed the sidewalk with calm, purposeful steps, but I noticed the relief in his eyes long before he reached us. Ethan looked up, smiled widely, and ran straight toward him. "Uncle Damien." The little boy wrapped both arms around his waist. Damien crouched immediately, checking that Ethan was unharmed before resting one reassuring hand on the child's shoulder. "Thank you for staying with him," he said as he turned toward me. His voice carried the same quiet steadiness I remembered from the afternoon we gathered colored pencils together. I smiled. He was very brave. He only needed someone to remind him that he was not alone. Ethan tugged gently on Damien's sleeve. "She told funny stories while we waited." Damien looked at me for a long moment, and something softened behind his usually composed expression. "Most people would have assumed someone else would stop to help," he said. I shrugged lightly. Children should never have to wonder whether an adult will notice them. For a brief second the city noise seemed to disappear. Damien held my gaze with thoughtful silence before thanking me once again. As he guided Ethan toward the waiting SUV, the little boy turned around and waved enthusiastically. I waved back, unaware that the unexpected meeting had quietly transformed me from someone Damien respected into someone his family would never forget. The following morning I found myself smiling for reasons I could not explain. Maybe it was Ethan's cheerful wave. Maybe it was the realization that one difficult week had not managed to erase every good moment from my life. I arrived early at the community center carrying fresh sketchbooks that I had purchased with the little money I had left. The children greeted me as though I had never disappeared from my classroom at all. Their excitement wrapped around me like warm sunlight after days of rain. For 2 wonderful hours I forgot that my name still floated across social media beside words that did not belong to me. I only remembered the smell of crayons, the sound of laughter, and the quiet satisfaction that came from watching a child discover confidence with a paintbrush. When class ended, the director handed me a sealed envelope. I assumed it contained next week's schedule until I opened it outside beneath the shade of an oak tree. Inside was a generous donation made anonymously to expand the center's art program. There was no signature. No business logo. Only a short handwritten note that read, "Every child deserves a place where kindness is remembered longer than mistakes." I read the sentence twice before carefully folding the card back into the envelope. Whoever had written those words understood something the world seemed to have forgotten. Across town Damien sat inside a conference room surrounded by executives discussing acquisitions, construction permits, and investment reports worth millions of dollars. Normally he listened to every detail with complete focus. Today his attention drifted toward the photograph resting beside his tablet. It was not a glamorous picture. One of his employees had quietly captured Claire laughing with a circle of children while helping them paint paper butterflies. There was no audience to impress. No cameras she knew about. Only simple joy. One executive paused his presentation after noticing Damien had not spoken for several minutes. "Is something wrong, sir?" Damien looked up calmly. "No. Continue." Yet even while the meeting resumed, he found himself thinking about the handwritten note he had instructed someone to deliver without revealing its source. He had expected nothing in return. Still, part of him wondered whether she had smiled when she read it. Later that afternoon I stopped at a neighborhood coffee shop before heading home. The young cashier hesitated after recognizing me from the viral video. My heartbeat quickened, preparing for another uncomfortable moment. Instead, she quietly slid a warm blueberry muffin onto my tray. "It is on the house," she whispered. "My little sister goes to the community center. She talks about you all the time. She says you make everyone feel brave." I thanked her, suddenly unable to find the right words. Kindness always felt louder after cruelty. As I reached for my coffee, the door opened and Damien stepped inside wearing dark jeans beneath a simple navy jacket instead of the tailored suits I had seen before. For the first time he looked less like an executive and more like an ordinary man stopping for an afternoon drink. Our eyes met with easy recognition. He smiled politely before walking toward the counter. "Fancy meeting you again," he said. I laughed softly. Either New York is much smaller than I thought, or we both have very predictable routines. "Perhaps a little of both," he replied. Neither of us noticed the curious glances from other customers. For a few peaceful minutes the internet disappeared, the city grew quieter, and two strangers shared an ordinary conversation without realizing that destiny had already begun rearranging both of their lives. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I allowed myself to believe that life might actually be moving forward. That belief lasted exactly 2 days. Early Friday morning my phone buzzed before sunrise. I reached for it expecting another message from the community center about weekend classes. Instead I found dozens of new notifications flooding the screen faster than I could read them. Another video had appeared overnight. Someone had stitched together old clips from the charity gala with new commentary, claiming I had manipulated the entire incident to gain sympathy after my first attempt at becoming famous failed. The story made even less sense than the original one, but it spread twice as fast. By 8 o'clock strangers had once again decided they knew my heart better than I did. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood quietly beside the window while rain traced slow paths across the glass. It amazed me how exhausting it was to defend yourself against people who had already made up their minds. Around noon the director of the community center called. Her voice carried genuine regret. A local sponsor had threatened to withdraw funding if the center continued featuring me in children's programs. She apologized repeatedly before asking whether I would mind taking a short break until the attention settled down. I thanked her for her honesty because I knew she was trying to protect the children, not punish me. After the call ended, I remained sitting at my small kitchen table for nearly an hour without moving. The apartment felt strangely quiet again. My sketchbook remained open beside me, but I could not bring myself to draw a single line. Across Manhattan, Damien stood beside the wide windows of his office while one of his advisors displayed the newest headlines on a large screen. "Public opinion has shifted again," the advisor explained carefully. "Most companies would avoid any association with her until this disappears." Damien studied the articles without changing his expression. Then he asked one simple question. "Did anyone verify the new claims?" The room fell silent. No one had. The stories repeated each other without evidence, each headline borrowing confidence from the last. Damien closed the file. Rumors multiplied because they were convenient. Facts required effort. He instructed his team to identify the original source of the edited video, not to silence anyone, but to understand who had benefited from keeping the misunderstanding alive. Late that afternoon I forced myself outside for fresh air. Sitting alone with my thoughts had become more frightening than facing curious strangers. I walked through Riverside Park beneath rows of trees already beginning to glow with early summer leaves. Near the fountain, I noticed a familiar little voice calling my name. Ethan ran toward me with the same joyful smile I remembered, stopping just in front of me as though he wanted to make sure I was real. "Uncle Damien said you like drawing," he announced proudly while holding up a blank sketchbook almost identical to mine. "Will you teach me how to draw birds someday?" My heart softened instantly. "Of course I will," I answered with a smile. "Birds are easier than people because they never worry about what anyone thinks of their feathers." Ethan giggled. A few steps behind him, Damien approached at an unhurried pace. His calm eyes met mine, and without asking a single question, he seemed to understand that something had happened. "You look tired," he said quietly. I looked away for a moment before answering honestly. "It has been a difficult day." Damien did not offer empty encouragement or tell me to ignore the internet. Instead, he spoke with quiet certainty. "Sometimes the loudest voices are also the least accurate. The truth usually arrives later because it takes longer to walk." For reasons I could not explain, those words felt steadier than every headline had felt heavy. Damien's words stayed with me long after we said goodbye in the park. The truth usually arrives later because it takes longer to walk. I repeated that sentence to myself all weekend like a quiet prayer. It did not erase the comments or restore my job, but it reminded me that patience and surrender were not the same thing. On Monday morning I opened my laptop for the first time in days and began updating my resume. If one door remained closed, I would keep searching until another one opened. I had just finished rewriting my teaching philosophy when my email chimed with a message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line simply read, "We would like to meet with you." At first I assumed it was another prank. I had received enough of those lately to recognize the pattern. Still, something about the message felt different. It invited me to interview for a position leading a new community arts initiative funded by a private foundation. The location was downtown. The salary was generous enough that I read the number twice to make sure I had not imagined it. There was no explanation for how they had found me. Only a request that I come the following afternoon if I remained interested. I almost declined. Hope had become dangerous because disappointment always seemed to follow it. Yet something inside me whispered that fear should not be allowed to make every decision. The next afternoon I stood outside a beautifully restored brick building overlooking the Hudson River. Fresh flowers lined the entrance, and sunlight reflected from tall windows that filled the lobby with warmth instead of cold luxury. The receptionist welcomed me by name before guiding me upstairs. When the conference room door opened, I stopped walking. Damien stood beside the windows wearing another perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He looked every bit the confident executive I had first imagined, yet his expression remained as calm as it always had. "You," I said before I could stop myself. He smiled gently. I was beginning to think fate enjoyed repeating itself. I laughed despite my surprise. "I had no idea you worked here." "There are many things we have not discussed yet," he replied. "Please, have a seat." The interview did not feel like an interrogation. He asked about children, creativity, classrooms, and why I believed art mattered. I answered honestly because I no longer had the energy to pretend to be anyone else. I told him that every child deserved at least one adult who believed in them before they believed in themselves. I admitted that mistakes should become lessons instead of permanent labels. Damien listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he folded his hands together and remained silent for several thoughtful seconds. Finally he spoke. "Claire, this foundation has spent years investing in buildings, supplies, and programs. We have learned that none of those matter without the right people. I believe you are one of those people." My throat tightened. "You hardly know me." His gray eyes held mine with quiet certainty. "I know enough to recognize integrity when I see it." Before I could answer, another executive entered carrying several folders. The moment he noticed Damien, his posture changed instantly. Respect filled the room without a single word being spoken. He addressed Damien not as another manager, but as the man whose approval clearly shaped every important decision inside the organization. Watching the exchange, I realized the quiet stranger who had helped gather colored pencils, comforted Ethan, and spoken gently in a coffee shop was far more influential than I had ever imagined, and for the first time I began wondering who Damien DeLuca truly was when the rest of the city was watching. When I walked out of the foundation that afternoon, the wind coming off the Hudson felt different against my face. It was not because I had been offered a new opportunity. It was because I had finally met someone who listened before reaching a conclusion. That feeling had become so rare that I almost did not recognize it anymore. Damien walked beside me toward the front entrance without saying much. He seemed like the kind of man who understood that silence could be just as comforting as conversation. Before I stepped onto the sidewalk, he handed me a simple folder. Inside were the details of the arts initiative, photographs of classrooms waiting to be restored, and letters written by children describing why they loved drawing. There were no contracts demanding an immediate answer. No pressure. Only trust. Take your time, he said quietly. The work matters too much for rushed decisions. I thanked him and promised to read every page. As my car disappeared into afternoon traffic, Damien remained standing beneath the building's stone archway, watching until I turned the corner. Back upstairs, the atmosphere inside the executive conference room shifted the moment he returned. Several members of the foundation's leadership team were already waiting. One of them carefully placed a tablet in front of Damien. We found the complete footage from the charity gala, he explained. 3 independent security cameras captured everything. Damien pressed play without speaking. This time the story unfolded exactly as it had happened. Claire reached to steady the elderly volunteer. The influencer stepped backward without looking. The collision lasted less than a second. Every accusation that had spread across the internet collapsed under the weight of simple reality. Another advisor looked up from a report. We also traced the edited version. It was heavily cropped before being reposted by several large accounts that never verified the original footage. Damien closed the tablet slowly. Truth had existed from the beginning. It had simply been ignored because outrage traveled faster. By the following morning, the foundation released the complete unedited recording together with statements from event staff and the elderly volunteer herself. They did not attack anyone. They did not accuse anyone. They simply presented the full story exactly as it had happened. Within hours, journalists who had repeated the earlier version began updating their reports. Television stations invited media experts to discuss the dangers of selective editing. The same commentators who had mocked me only days earlier suddenly spoke about fairness, responsibility, and second chances. My phone filled with new notifications again, but this time they felt strangely unfamiliar. Messages of apology arrived from people I had never met. Former coworkers reached out to ask how I was doing. Parents from the school district admitted they wished they had waited before judging me. I appreciated every kind word, yet none of them erased the lonely evenings or quiet tears that had come before the truth. Late that afternoon, my principal called again. Her voice sounded lighter than it had in weeks. Claire, we would love to discuss bringing you back. The school board has reviewed everything. We know what really happened now. I thanked her sincerely and asked for a little time before making any decisions. Hanging up the phone, I realized something surprising. A week earlier I would have accepted immediately without hesitation. Now another path stood before me, one filled with children, creativity, and a foundation led by a man who had believed me before the evidence made believing easy. That evening, as the sun settled behind the Manhattan skyline, Damien received a brief message from one of his advisors. Public opinion has completely changed. He looked out across the glowing city lights before quietly setting his phone aside. He had never cared about changing public opinion. The only opinion that mattered now belonged to one woman who still had no idea how deeply she had already changed his world. 3 days later I accepted the position at the foundation, believing I was simply beginning a new chapter. I had no idea I was about to discover that every page before it had only been a preface. My first morning started with sunlight spilling across polished hardwood floors and a quiet hum of people who genuinely cared about making something meaningful. The building no longer felt intimidating. It felt hopeful. Children from several public schools would soon participate in the Foundation's new arts initiative, and every empty classroom waiting upstairs seemed full of possibility. Damien greeted me with the same calm smile that had become strangely familiar. There was no grand welcome, no formal speech, only a cup of coffee placed beside my notebook exactly the way I liked it, with one packet of sugar and a splash of cream. I looked at him in surprise. "How did you know how I drink my coffee?" He paused for a fraction of a second before answering. "I remembered from the coffee shop. You stirred it twice before taking the first sip." I laughed softly. "You notice everything, do not you?" "Sometimes," he replied. "Only the things that matter." The words lingered with me for the rest of the morning. We spent hours reviewing classroom designs, discussing scholarship programs, and reading letters from teachers requesting art supplies. Working beside Damien felt unexpectedly easy. He listened more than he spoke. Whenever someone presented an idea, he asked questions that made the project better instead of trying to prove he was the smartest person in the room. I understood why everyone respected him. Yet something still puzzled me. Executives twice his age deferred to every decision he made without hesitation. Staff members straightened the moment he entered a room. Visitors greeted him with a level of admiration that seemed almost unusual for the director of a charitable foundation. Shortly after lunch I walked into the library searching for curriculum binders. The room was empty except for an older gentleman organizing historical photographs inside a display cabinet. We introduced ourselves, and when I mentioned how impressive the foundation was, he smiled warmly. "You have changed him, Miss Bennet." I blinked in confusion. "I am sorry." "Changed who?" "Mr. DeLuca. He rarely laughs. Lately everyone has noticed the difference." Before I could ask another question, someone called him away. My curiosity only grew stronger. Later that afternoon I stepped into the hallway outside Damien's office, intending to ask whether he had a few minutes to discuss the children's summer program. His door stood slightly open. I was about to knock when two visitors emerged from inside. Both men wore expensive suits and spoke with remarkable respect. One of them shook Damien's hand before saying, "The council appreciates everything your family has done for the city over the years. We are grateful for your support, Mr. DeLuca." The second man lowered his voice. "The DeLuca name still carries extraordinary influence. We are fortunate to have your cooperation." They walked away before noticing me. I remained standing in the hallway, unexpectedly unsettled. The DeLuca name. Extraordinary influence. Questions I had ignored suddenly demanded answers. That evening, unable to quiet my curiosity, I searched Damien DeLuca's name online. At first I found articles about philanthropy, business investments, educational programs, and hospital donations. Then older reports appeared. Carefully written stories describing one of New York's most private and powerful family empires, a family surrounded for decades by whispers, speculation, and influence that reached far beyond ordinary business. Nothing I read accused Damien personally of wrongdoing, yet the reputation surrounding the DeLuca name was impossible to ignore. I stared at the glowing screen long after midnight, remembering the man who gathered colored pencils from the sidewalk, comforted children, and believed me before anyone else did. The gentle stranger I had come to trust suddenly stood beside a history I could barely understand, and for the first time since meeting Damien, I wondered whether opening my heart to him meant stepping into a world that could change my life forever. The next morning I arrived at the foundation earlier than usual, hoping work would quiet the questions that had followed me home the night before. Instead, every hallway seemed to echo with them. I had spent hours reading articles about the DeLuca family, and although most of them relied on speculation rather than proof, one fact remained impossible to ignore. Damien belonged to a world built on influence, power, and carefully guarded secrets. Yet every memory I carried of him contradicted the image painted by those headlines. He was the man who stopped to gather colored pencils from a sidewalk, who spoke gently to frightened children, who believed in me before anyone else did. Both versions of Damien could not exist at the same time. Or perhaps they could, and that possibility frightened me even more. I found him standing alone inside one of the unfinished art studios, studying colorful murals that local students had begun painting across the walls. Morning sunlight poured through tall windows, catching tiny flecks of dried paint suspended in the air. He turned as I entered, smiling with the same quiet warmth I had come to expect. "Good morning, Claire." I tried to return the smile, but honesty reached my face before politeness could. "We need to talk." He nodded once, almost as though he had expected those words. "Of course." We sat on opposite sides of a long wooden table surrounded by unopened boxes of brushes and canvases. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally I took a slow breath. "I searched your name last night." The room remained perfectly still. Damien lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at me. "I assumed you eventually would. Why did you never tell me who you really were?" "Because I wanted you to meet me before meeting my last name." His answer came quietly, without hesitation or excuse. I folded my hands together to keep them from trembling. "Are the stories true?" He chose his words with remarkable care. "Some are exaggerated. Some are completely false. My family has lived under public scrutiny for decades. We have made difficult decisions, but my life today is dedicated to building schools, hospitals, scholarships, and opportunities that give people better choices than the ones previous generations had." I studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Instead I found something unexpected. Weariness. Not fear of being discovered, but exhaustion from carrying assumptions that had existed long before either of us met. "Then why keep helping me?" I whispered. "You could have found someone with a much easier life." Damien smiled sadly. "Because you never treated people according to their reputation. I watched you help strangers when nobody was watching. I watched you protect a frightened child before you knew his family. You reminded me that character is revealed in ordinary moments, not public headlines." I looked away toward the unfinished murals. Part of me wanted to believe every word he said. Another part feared what accepting his world might cost. Damien stood slowly but remained several feet away, respecting the distance I had created. "Claire, if knowing my name makes this too difficult, I will understand if you choose to leave the foundation. The program will continue exactly as we planned. Your career will never depend on staying close to me." The quiet certainty in his voice caught me by surprise. He was offering me complete freedom at the very moment he risked losing everything we had built together. For the first time since learning the truth, I realized that the most powerful thing Damien DeLuca had given me was never influence, opportunity, or protection. It was the right to choose my own future without pressure, and that choice suddenly mattered more than every rumor I had ever read. A week passed before I finally understood that some decisions could not be made with fear alone. Every morning I walked through classrooms slowly filling with easels, bright paints, and hopeful voices. Every afternoon I watched children who had once apologized for every crooked line begin raising their hands with confidence. The foundation was changing lives long before anyone noticed the finished murals hanging on the walls. It was changing mine as well. I realized that I had spent too much of my life allowing strangers to define people before giving them the chance to define themselves. I refused to make the same mistake with Damien. One quiet evening I asked him to meet me on the rooftop terrace overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city shimmered beneath a sky painted with deep blue and soft gold, while a gentle breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic far below. He arrived wearing the same calm expression that had never demanded anything from me. Instead of speaking immediately, he simply waited. I appreciated that about him. He never rushed difficult moments. I took a slow breath before breaking the silence. "When the world judged me, you looked for the truth instead. I almost forgot to do the same for you." Damien lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back at me. "You never owed me that." I smiled gently. "Maybe not. But I owe it to myself." I stepped closer until only a comfortable distance remained between us. "I have seen the articles. I have heard the rumors. I also remember the man who stopped to help me gather colored pencils from the sidewalk, who sat beside a frightened little boy without worrying about appearances, who built classrooms instead of monuments to himself, and who gave me the freedom to walk away even when it meant losing something important. Those things are real too. The evening breeze stirred softly between us. Damien's voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. I was afraid that once you knew everything, you would only see the family name. I shook my head. A family name explains where someone comes from. It does not decide who they become. For the first time since I had met him, I watched the carefully controlled walls around Damien begin to disappear. Not through dramatic words or grand promises, but through relief. Genuine, human relief. He smiled in a way I had never seen before, warm enough to reach his eyes completely. Ethan would later insist that was the first real smile his uncle had worn in years. Over the following months, the arts initiative expanded into schools across the city. Volunteers arrived every weekend. Local businesses donated supplies. Parents who had once recognized me because of a viral misunderstanding now recognized me because their children came home excited to paint, create, and believe in themselves. Occasionally someone apologized for believing the worst about me. I always accepted with gratitude because forgiveness weighs far less than resentment. One afternoon, a little girl handed me a drawing of two people standing beneath a bright yellow sunrise. She pointed at the taller figure and whispered, "That is the man who believed in you." Then she pointed at the smaller figure. "And that is the lady who taught everyone else how." I looked toward Damien across the room. He was kneeling beside a group of children, helping them clean paintbrushes with the same patience he showed during every ordinary moment that no headline would ever capture. I finally understood that being chosen was never about being rescued. It was about being truly seen. Millions of people had once formed an opinion after watching only a few seconds of my life. One man had taken the time to watch the whole story. In the end, that single act of patience changed everything, because the greatest gift anyone can give another person is not power, wealth, or influence. It is the courage to see the truth before the crowd does, and the wisdom to stay after everyone else has already walked away.